Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. We are excited to welcome many of you back today for our final session of the 2021 Climate Leadership Series. I'm Nat Cohan, president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES. And in partnership with our co-host, the Climate Registry, we've been convening the CLC for 10 years running to address the climate crisis by featuring leading thinkers and doers on policy, innovation, and business solutions. Although we hope to meet in person again this year, this virtual series has already reached more than 2,000 climate leaders. We've heard from administration officials, governors, CEOs, and experts on net zero pathways, transportation, the role of electric utilities, equity issues, financing the transition, and much more. These conversations are all available on the CLC YouTube page, and we encourage you to check them out. Throughout the past year, we've seen a steady stream of deepening commitments from countries, subnational governments, and companies. At COP26 in Glasgow, powerful global partnerships and international cooperative agreements were announced. There was so much enthusiasm and appetite for strengthening ambition and tackling important challenges like transparency and reporting and accounting for emissions, reducing methane emissions and methane pollution, and financing adaptation and resilience. As we gear up for 2022, we're going to focus on implementation and making good on those commitments. Companies and subnational actors will play a key role, and we look forward to supporting the conversations that can further ambition and progress. That said, we are already seeing how climate-linked extreme weather events and climate hazards are harming communities across the globe and also across the country. And a critical need is preparing for the climate impacts that we're seeing today and that we know will only get worse going forward in the years ahead. In 2021, the US has already seen 18 weather disasters costing at least $1 billion damages each. This follows $22 billion disasters in 2020, which broke the previous annual record set in recent years. So every year we're seeing as many or more of these billion-dollar extreme weather disasters. Climate change, paired with the long acknowledged backlog of repair and maintenance needs, has meant that we have increasingly vulnerable critical assets and has highlighted the need for bold investment in resilient infrastructure and the communities that rely on it. So we're joined today to talk about that by leaders and experts who are working to advance climate resilient cities. There are many ways to weave resilience into the fabric of our communities, and today we're focusing on the infrastructure investments that can serve to mitigate risk and address adaptation needs. We'll hear from FEMA leadership, then a panel of experts, and we'll round out the day with an interview with the mayor of New Orleans, LaToya Cantrell. First, a few bits of housekeeping. This event is meant to engage you, and we encourage your participation, even though we can't be together in person. We invite you to submit questions for our panelists using the chat function on the right side of your screen. If you require assistance during the event, please email questions@climateleadershipconference.org. Today's sessions will be recorded and made available on the CLC YouTube channel in the coming days. And finally, I want to share our gratitude for the support of our 2021 sponsors. Special thanks to our headline sponsor, Bloomberg Philanthropies, our host city sponsor, Entergy, our platinum sponsor, Dominion, and gold sponsors, Intel and SoCalGas. You can learn more about these organizations in the exhibit hall. And now I'll turn it over to Verena Radulovic, Vice President for Business Engagement at C2ES, who will be leading a conversation with Eric Letvin, the Assistant Deputy Administrator for Mitigation at FEMA. Hi, Verena. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks very much. Well, thanks for that introduction. We are at a pivotal moment to ensure that the country's infrastructure is prepared for climate impacts. And as Nat mentioned, there's a lot to talk about in this space. With each new investment that we make in our communities, we are presented with an opportunity to ensure that those dollars are spent to help us withstand climate impacts in the decades to come. Now, with the recent passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, otherwise known as the Infrastructure Package, which will funnel billions of dollars towards resilience and aging infrastructure over the coming years, we have a unique opportunity to prepare our communities for the next extreme weather event. First, we're going to take a look at the federal level. I'm really excited to talk with Eric Letvin today, who is Deputy Assistant Administrator for Mitigation at FEMA, or as the Federal Emergency Management Agency is more often known. Mr. Letvin directs FEMA's pre- and post-disaster mitigation programs that support sustainable, disaster-resilient communities, and also really to avoid and reduce the loss of life, property, and financial impacts of the natural hazards that we're seeing more and more. These programs include the BRIC program, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities Grant Program, Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grants, the Floodplain Management component of the National Flood Insurance Program, and the Community Rating System under the NFIP. So Eric's busy. I just want to bring him on to stage and welcome him. And we're going to go ahead and get started with the conversation. Hey, Eric, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time. We know you're busy. And so what I'd like to do, I've just introduced you, I'd like to dive right into a couple of questions for you. In light of the increasing impacts that many of our communities are seeing, as well as our infrastructure, can you tell us about how FEMA is considering its approach more broadly to pre- and post-disaster mitigation?
Sure, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here today. So real excited, just a few hours ago, FEMA released our updated strategic plan, and that emphasizes how climate is changing and exacerbating natural disasters, and underscores how our agency will try to more equitably distribute funding to historically underserved communities. So it requires FEMA to build up our own capacity and capability to support climate adaptation, but also it supports increasing climate resiliency among the emergency management community. You mentioned a lot of the programs that I'm responsible for. So hazard mitigation, again, is any sustainable action that reduces or eliminates the long-term risk to people and property from damage. And mitigation planning is really the foundation of that. All states and local governments are required to have an updated hazard mitigation plan. And so that plan outlines what those solutions that reduce the impacts of disaster happen at the local level. And that's where our grant programs come in. Our hazard mitigation assistance programs, as you mentioned, support to taking those actions to reduce the impacts of the disasters. You mentioned the infrastructure package, but even before that, the president authorized almost $3.5 billion of mitigation. Essentially, what they did was they modified the COVID declarations for each state, tribe, and territory, making $3.5 billion available, a one-time increase, a really historic amount of money that's going to help communities to take those actions to really move forward what is in their hazard mitigation plans. And currently, right now, you mentioned BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. We have an open application period, closes at the end of January. We have $1.16 billion in our competitive pre-disaster mitigation grant programs, BRIC and Flood Mitigation Assistance. So those close at the end of January. So right now, there are literally billions of dollars of funding that we have never seen at this level. So a lot of excitement, a lot of pressure, obviously, but it's really a shared responsibility, FEMA, state and local governments, and the private sector to help us get those dollars to where they're actually needed.
Yep. I'm gonna jump to a question. Maybe more if you can be more specific. Are there certain programs or areas that you see really expanding under the Infrastructure Act and the strategic plan that you just mentioned earlier?
Yes. So specifically, all the funding I just mentioned right there was made available before the infrastructure package. So we are obviously closely watching the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So that brings another $6.8 billion for mitigation to FEMA. So specifically, what that does is it adds another $1 billion to BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities, over 5 years, $200 million per year. That's in addition to the funding that normally goes into BRIC from all of the disaster declarations. For flood mitigation assistance, that program is eligible for policyholders in the National Flood Insurance Program, and we have about 5 million of those policies. That provides $3.5 billion over 5 years that allows us to, for those repetitive loss structures, to take those mitigation actions, so acquiring a property, elevating a property, flood proofing, some flood control projects. So that really helps us, break the cycle of loss and end disaster suffering. And we have a new, very exciting tool in the mitigation toolbox, the Safeguarding Tomorrow Through Ongoing Risk Mitigation, or STORM Act, was signed into law actually last year. It was authorized, but we received a $500 million appropriation under the Infrastructure Act. And what that is, that's a revolving loan fund, $100 million per year over 5 years. So that's kind of similar to what the EPA currently runs under the Clean Water Act for water and wastewater improvements. Now we have a new tool that can be used where we would capitalize state governments, and they can provide low interest loans to local governments to take action. And finally, there's $733 million in there to enhance dam safety and rehabilitate or remove aging dams.
Oh, thank you. That's really, really helpful to know kind of where in specifically the money is different than where it was before. I do want to shift focus a bit to looking at priorities in advancing equity and how that might intersect with FEMA's work. We know that that's an important element of this administration's priorities. Can you talk a bit about how FEMA is addressing equity in its different programs and offerings, and how it might be changing its approaches based on some of the priorities of this administration?
Yeah, it was great. I was hoping we'd get the strategic plan released before I was talking today at 1 o'clock, and it did come out earlier. So goal 1 of our strategic plan is to install equity as a foundation of emergency management. So that relates not only to our workforce, but achieving equitable outcomes for those that we serve. So that's super exciting. I encourage everyone to go and look at our strategic plan. There's also some executive orders that we are currently working through in this space. Executive Order 14008 on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. And part of that order was something called the Justice 40 Initiative. Justice 40 centers on environmental, racial, and economic justice for communities of color systematically affected by poverty, pollution, underinvestment, and other equities. And so our both BRIC and flood mitigation assistance are pilot grant programs under Justice 40. So what that means is the goal is that 40% of the overall benefits of those federal investments in those grant programs should flow to those disadvantaged communities. And so we also made some other changes within our programs, even before these executive orders come out. Within BRIC, we're trying to target benefits to disadvantaged communities through increased allocations for tribal governments. And we doubled the number of communities who may receive direct technical assistance.
And Eric, I remember when you and I were having a conversation beforehand, there were some other specific areas that you had mentioned where there might be some opportunities for embedding equity or changing the way that FEMA does things in things like customer service or loan applications. Are you able to talk a little bit about some of the real in the weeds in terms of the actual implementation of some of these pre and post disaster mitigation programs?
Yeah, I think the real everything happens at the local level. So in terms of how do I look for opportunities to partner or affect things at the local level? So the local hazard mitigation planning process is really where all the partners are engaged to understand what those hazards are and to figure out what actions are going to take place to make that community more resilient. And so a lot of the programs that we have supporting things like building codes and hazard mitigation planning really occurs at that local level. And that's the place I think where it's probably best to engage to make a difference in a particular community, but also at the state level as well.
And I think we're going to hear more about that in our next discussion, as well as in our remarks by Mayor Cantrell. I did want to ask you one last question. And I think, when we look at this all hands on deck approach, and there's a real need for not only the federal government, but state and local governments, as well as the private sector, to all be investing in resilience. Can you share a little bit about how the private sector and local practitioners could continue to, or maybe further plug into FEMA activities and opportunities?
Yeah, so there's, I know there's probably a lot of your members here that are consultants. So there's, as these dollars flow through the state at the local level, so there's a lot of opportunities for both consultants and the private sector, utilities or private companies. Obviously, we're going to need a tremendous amount of help at the state and local government level. These dollars are flowing down, and there's quite frankly, a lot of folks are looking for help in putting together mitigation applications, looking to leverage. Our funds have a 75-25 match, so where those 25 cents on the dollar going to come from? So the private sector, philanthropies, the local governments are always looking for a source of match, or nonprofits or what have you. So as these dollars flow, there's tremendous opportunities to engage all levels of government to try to make a difference, to make communities more resilient.
Eric, I do have one. I'm going to give you the last word as we're coming to a close here with our discussion here. But given that the strategic plan was just released this morning, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience on your view on where FEMA, your office is going, the mitigation program, or if there's anything from the strategic plan that you'd like to highlight for folks?
There's part of the strategic plan that talks about, I think the real challenge and opportunity for us is really incorporating from our sister agencies and the interagency that do climate research, like NOAA and National Science Foundation, USGS, and others. How do we, the building codes and standards right now are really only addressing past risk. Now we have to try to incorporate future risk, sea level rise, all the things that are in the National Climate Assessment. And the challenge is, as we spend these dollars, how do we incorporate future risk in the latest climate data so the investments that we make today are going to last during the life of that infrastructure? So I think we talk about that in our strategic plan, but I think that's a real challenge for not just us in government, but the private sector to understand what is that future risk and how do we build these dollars out smartly?
And how do we all assess the future risk in a way that is either uniform across sectors or approaches that are transparent, so we all know how we're assessing risk differently or in similar ways. So I think you've really touched on something that is not just something government is facing, but the private sector very much is facing as well. Eric, thank you so much. I know we can have you up here for the entire hour. I know you're a fount of knowledge, and we'd welcome you back at another time. But for now, thank you for your remarks.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.
And with that, I'd like to bring up my teammate, Laura Brush, who's our fellow for resilience at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, where we both work. And Laura is going to kick off to our next panel.
Thank you, Verena, and hi, everyone. As Verena said, I'm Laura Brush, and I'm the Resilience Fellow at C2ES. I'm really glad to be here today and with some excellent panelists. So before introducing them, I'd like to start by setting the stage a bit for the conversation. As was mentioned at the beginning, this year, communities across the U.S. have continued to see frequent and intense climate change-related flooding and wildfires, drought, and other hazards. And these events are having severe impacts on our communities and local economies and the infrastructure that they rely on. So implementing climate resilience strategies, from green infrastructure to structural elevation to grid hardening, among many others, can help avoid the worst impacts of these events and help cities remain competitive even as the climate changes. Fortunately, long overdue funding and resources to support the resilience of our infrastructure will be provided by the federal government via the recently enacted Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. The bill will do a number of things for resilience, including increased funding for existing pre-disaster hazard mitigation programs. It creates a new transportation resilience grant program. it incorporates resilience considerations into existing programs and also launches new research efforts that will help us better understand the best strategies for increasing the resilience of assets like surface transportation. It also boosts funding and opens up existing programs for natural solutions like restoring wetlands or replacing impervious surfaces with green space. And though the bill provides an historic level of funding, more action is needed at the federal, state, and local levels, as well as in the private sector, to meet the scale of challenges that communities are facing. So today we'll discuss what is needed to leverage existing federal funds, catalyze private dollars, and scale up efforts to build climate resilient communities and infrastructure. So as far as the format for this session, we'll have a discussion with our panelists for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for audience questions. So I will now introduce our panelists. First, we have Emily Feenstra. She is the Managing Director for Government Relations and Infrastructure Initiatives at the American Society of Civil Engineers, ASCE. In her role, Emily oversees ASCE's Washington, D.C. office and leads public affairs and government relations for the society, including the development of ASCE's infrastructure report card. Previously, she served as Deputy Director of the U.S. Water Alliance. Next, we'll have William Shee. He is manager of the Accelerator program at CDP. William is leading CDP's efforts in supporting local governments and businesses in advancing collaborative climate action and sustainable infrastructure. William has worked in green finance, urban planning, real estate, and environmental services for different perspectives on complex environmental problems and their solutions. And finally, we'll have Damon Burns, who is the CEO of Finance New Orleans. Damon is a New Orleans native with over 15 years of experience in public finance, entrepreneurship, capital markets, and financial technology. Since 2016, he served as the CEO of Finance New Orleans, which is a quasi-government financial institution with a mission to invest in affordable housing, economic development, and climate resilience projects that improve the quality of life in New Orleans. So I'll first turn it to our panelists for some introductory remarks. Emily, let's start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Laura, and great to be with you all today. I'm here representing ASCE, and for those unfamiliar with ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers, we're 150,000 civil engineers around the country and actually across the globe working on projects ranging from transportation to water to energy to ports. And so I thought, kicking things off and doing a little stage setting as we talk about where we want to go when it comes to resilient infrastructure, also important to understand our baseline and where we are at this moment in time. And some of you might be familiar, since 1998, ASCE has been putting out an infrastructure report card every 4 years. It's really a snapshot in time of infrastructure conditions and funding needs, and it's grown a little bit larger each iteration, and we're up to 17 categories now, and you can see those grades on the screen here. But for the first time in 20 years since we've been doing the report card, we released this one in March 2021. We were out of the D's for our overall GPA. The GPA was at a C-, and you can see the arrows, the green arrows on the screen are the grades that went up from 4 years ago. So we've made some progress in key areas, including drinking water, energy, aviation, inland waterways, ports. We've seen cities and states kind of step up when it comes to local investment. We've seen a greater emphasis on asset management. And resilience is one of the key criteria that we use to determine, our civil engineer team uses to determine those grades, looking at federal data. But you can also see, and those of you that are parents, a C- is not really anything to brag about. You wouldn't want your kid to come home with a C-. We have a lot of work to do. We still have 11 grades, in fact, stuck in the D's. And there's kind of a number of trends that we see there. A lot of these infrastructure assets in our country were built out 50 or 100 years ago. You just look at water pipes, for example. We've still got, especially in the Northeast, wooden water pipes in place from the Civil War in some instances. We have a water main break every 2 minutes in our country. That's not resilient. we have 43% of roads across the country that are in poor or mediocre condition. Half of Americans still lack access to transit. And we know that transit is key to jobs and opportunity in so many communities. So we have our work cut out for us. And speaking about the recent legislation, not hyperbole to say that this is a huge win and a long time coming for our nation's infrastructure. ASCE was really celebrating the fact that, this bill is comprehensive in comparison to other bills where you might have seen something move forward on transportation or water individually. This really takes a holistic look at our infrastructure. It has $50 billion. You heard some great information from Eric at FEMA on the new programs for resilience. We have been huge supporters of the FEMA BRIC program, the Resilience Revolving Loan Fund, the flood resilience programs. All of these are kind of baked in, boosting existing programs, creating new programs such as the Protect grants at DOT, and then even looking at the grant criteria. Resilience is included in that. So we think this legislation moves the United States closer to a target of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. It strengthens infrastructure in the face of increasing strong and destructive storms, and it strengthens and protects the most impacted communities. So happy to talk more about that in our Q&A, and we really thank Congress and the administration for their leadership on infrastructure.
Thanks so much, Emily. Now we will turn to William.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is William. I work for CDP, a global nonprofit that has been called the world's environmental report card, as we work with over 14,000 organizations globally, including private sector companies, local jurisdictions, and financial institutions to track, benchmark, and accelerate the progress towards addressing climate change. We have a critical mass of companies, governments, investors, and we've seen the disclosure that highlights the risks and opportunities and drives strategic planning past sort of the traditional ways of addressing issues. And we're trying to create a level playing field and regulatory certainty, which will benefit companies and local governments in today's highly competitive environment, both for business, but also for government. And just to highlight a little bit of the risks and opportunities that Emily has spoken about on infrastructure, throughout data and disclosures, we have seen massive amount of projects being disclosed to us. In the United States alone, there are 97 cities disclosing about 304 sustainable infrastructure projects valued at $25.6 billion US dollars. This is out of our infrastructure snapshot report that CDP released recently. So we believe the theory of change is that with this data, this environmental impacts disclosed by companies and cities, we're better able to help decision makers drive capital into the right places. And in this way, we believe there's a massive opportunity for collaboration between the public and private sectors to capitalize on these infrastructure opportunities. And ensure that we're building an economy and ensuring that cities are safe, healthy, and resilient places for the future. Additionally, I would like to add that the 14,000 organizations across the world includes state-level actors as well. So states and regions. We have globally around 800 cities, states, local jurisdictions reporting to us of the many kinds of opportunities and risks that they're facing. So this is an important time. The types of infrastructure reported has also increased tremendously over the last few years. So we do see a distinct sort of focus and opportunity here in terms of sustainable infrastructure and making our cities better. And to that end, just one more thing I want to add is that CDP has launched the Accelerator program this year to help provide better support for cities and companies who are looking to collaborate on local projects, sustainability projects. And I'm happy to share more information in the coming panel discussion. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so for Emily and William, just to get a little more information on the risks and what's at stake and what's really needed for for infrastructure, and as we see the changing climate. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how climate-related risks to infrastructure make a city less resilient overall, and how enhancing the resilience of both new and existing infrastructure can support communities in addressing those risks, but also gaining new opportunities.
Sure, I'm happy to start. We've seen lots, unfortunately, we've seen lots of examples at the local level of kind of climate risks playing out in communities and the impacts there. And just one that comes to mind is, we saw soaring temperatures in the Pacific Northwest this summer. They were reaching 115 degrees, and you actually saw pavement buckling and, concrete damage, because in places like Phoenix, Arizona, they might design the roadways or use certain materials knowing they're going to reach those temperatures. But to see, that temperature in other parts of the country, we just haven't prepared for that. And when we look at scenarios, they're just going to have to get broader, more extremes. Another great example that was national attention was the Texas energy grid, and there was the power going out, and then there were the water utilities who hadn't planned for freezing temperatures. They'd planned for really warm temperatures. So to pick up on something Eric mentioned, and this is something we're working closely with NOAA and NIST on, is taking the climate change data that we have and building it into building codes and standards. So in addition to the policy shop and the report card, most of ASCE is a technical society, and we churn out a lot of professional building codes and ways basically to design infrastructure for certain parts of the country. We look at wind loads and snow loads and flood conditions, and have very prescriptive standards for how you would design in such a scenario. So we need to make sure that all those standards that are coming out are using the best climate data. We know we've got some work to do in certain categories, and so it's a good partnership with NOAA. Even they got some funding in the infrastructure bill to update their rainfall data, for example. That's going to be huge for our engineers as they're designing dams and levees, just as another example.
And just speaking on opportunities, as I mentioned in our CDP snapshot report, there is a huge amount of need in terms of new infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure to make our cities better. But at the same time, it's actually a great opportunity to address a lot of the equity issues we've been facing over the many decades in this country, right? If you map the risks and vulnerabilities to climate change, with vulnerable populations or vulnerable communities, you could actually see a high correlation. So one way to address those inequities is by building better infrastructure to provide better services for these communities. And something that I think Damon could better touch on is that a lot of times these building energy efficiencies would actually, in conjunction with affordable housing, can actually make housing more affordable when done the right way. So that's another way to address sort of increased pressures on housing prices in many major cities. As an urban planner, working as an urban planner in the city of LA, we've seen that effect, right? So having more affordable housing that's safer and more resilient is actually a great opportunity to address many of the socioeconomic inequalities and inequities that we've been seeing in this country. Just touching on that a little.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you both said speaks to the fact that resilience solutions can have benefits for so many other aspects that we want to improve in our cities. So I'm wondering, for the cities that you engage with or the infrastructure leaders that you engage with, have you seen increasing interest in infrastructure resilience in recent years? And if so, has this been spurred mainly by large disasters occurring in communities, or are leaders starting to consider risks and opportunities more so before disasters strike, which, as we know, can save a lot of damage as well as taxpayer dollars?
I think it's a combination of many of these above factors. over the last couple of years, we have seen increased projects being disclosed to CDP. I believe in the last year, we've seen a close to 50% increase in terms of the number of projects that have been disclosed to us on needs. But also that's also us growing our disclosure base. More cities disclose to us as they see the need for more data transparency and data sharing, so that we need to get this information out there. And as Eric touched on earlier, there's a huge opportunity for the public and private sectors to come together, right? By providing this knowledge sharing, by providing this kind of data, we're able to bring together the necessary partners who might be interested in projects to work together, to leverage financing together in order to achieve better outcomes. And that is part of the reason why I think we're seeing a lot more of these opportunities coming up. But in addition, as we've mentioned, we have been seeing extremely disastrous sort of weather events that are becoming increasing in frequency. And in that sense, I think there's been more attention to the types of infrastructure, the infrastructure needs that we have within this country, as Emily has pointed out.
Yeah, those are great points. And I'll just add, I mean, I think it is all of the above. Whenever we do have a disaster, we can look even at our report card website. I mentioned one slide, we have a ton of information there. The number of hits we get after a bridge collapse, the grid outage. I mean, people just flock to information when there is that kind of unfortunate event. But on the flip side, we have seen a huge interest. Mayors, city council members, governors, they all don't want to be in this position where they're constantly reacting. So there's a great desire to be proactive, to have some of these resilience programs in place for pre-mitigation dollars. I mentioned our standards. We did a Capitol Hill briefing, I guess it was pre-pandemic at this point, and I've never seen Hill staff take pictures of our 200-page standard book, but they were doing that. So seeing a lot of interest in kind of getting into those details. Rhetoric is good, but how exactly are we going to do this? So positive momentum there.
My name is Damon Burns. I'm the CEO of Finance New Orleans. We are the City of New Orleans' green finance agency. We're a combination of things, but ultimately we focus on sustainable housing and resilient infrastructure. And we're also investing in the innovation of our neighborhoods too. So we're taking on a new and expanded role. Historically, we've focused on single family housing, but we realized through Katrina, the recession, and many other disasters that our focus and strategy needs to be much wider and greater in order to create the impact that we want. So we're on a quest to create $1 billion impact in New Orleans using our public finance platform. We're working very closely with local banks, developers, technology startups, even local corporations, everybody that can that we can put in our gumbo pot, if you will, to put all the things in order to have a more resilient New Orleans. So, and one of the other things that we've done under the Mayor Cantrell's leadership, which you'll hear from her later, we created the Resilient New Orleans Finance Plan, which is an extension of the city's resilience plan that was created a few years back. But we put some specific financing measures or mechanisms in place that all public agencies could follow. So we're on that blueprint as well as other agencies to use or to create more resilient infrastructure in New Orleans. And there's a lot of focus on mixing public and private dollars together. So we're excited to be here and talk about the possibilities, because we do think there are many, especially as it relates to large corporations, other types of private enterprises that ordinarily don't mix in the public finance market. We think now is a great opportunity to merge those worlds to create the kind of impact that we all want to see in our different cities across the world. So thank you, Laura, and looking forward to answering some questions.
Excellent. Thanks, Damon. Glad you could come back and join us. So pivoting to the public funding side of things and the recently passed infrastructure, I'm wondering if you could each speak to the provisions in the infrastructure bill that you see as most important for increasing the resilience of infrastructure, and also where there's a need for additional action from federal policymakers.
I can start, or go ahead, Damon.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. So one thing that I can speak on from our perspective, we have many interest in the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better plan. especially as it relates to jumpstarting the resilient infrastructure conversation, or not the conversation, but the projects themselves. Because we're starting from scratch in many cases, there isn't a blueprint on how to build green buildings across a municipal portfolio, or how to integrate new technologies into a mortgage program. And those are some of the things that we've tried. But there's a big need for seed capital or seed funding of these concepts, in much the same way that we're seeding startups to build new technologies and seeding research labs, et cetera. So I think one thing the bill does is allocate funding directly for those new types of investments. However, I do think it can go a few steps further and encourage more private capital to come into the space, either through some sort of tax credit or, in the tax exempt bond market. That's also a tax incentive, or, incentivizing it. So I know there's a cost to doing those things, but they also just need to be measured against the potential impacts that are out there. So we're talking about completely transforming all of our cities. That's a great opportunity. And that's a big economic opportunity to put many companies to work and to put many companies into business that probably don't exist today. So I do think, next levels of the infrastructure plan, because this is just the start. This can't be a one-time thing. So moving forward, there just needs to be more focus on, merging the ecosystem, or incentivizing the entire ecosystem of players, so that we can reach the full scale of the resilient infrastructure needs across the country.
Thanks. And I just wanted to echo, again, you heard from Eric at FEMA about some of the programs they were excited about. In a lot of ways, this infrastructure bill, funds the things that were working well. So we're not just having this kind of slow drip, spreading peanut butter really thin, however you want to call it. It kind of turbocharges a lot of these programs. Again, FEMA BRIC was totally oversubscribed, and now with these successive boosts since the program started in 2019, they're going to be able to help a lot more communities. The funding for high hazard dams, there used to be something like 10 million for the entire country. So we're going to see a lot more funding to address the nation's dams and make our communities more resilient downstream of those dams. Maybe a couple areas that aren't in FEMA's purview, but very important. I'd point to the transportation programs within US DOT. They actually have a little over half of the funding is going to be directed to US DOT. There are these PROTECT grants that are new that focus on transportation resilience. There's an emphasis on resilience in the bridges program and bringing those bridges up to a state of good repair. And then looking at the energy sector, grid resilience. And there's a program just for rural communities. And there's also some good streamlining or authority given to FERC to help build out the nation's transmission lines, because in a lot of ways, to meet these ambitious renewable goals that we have, we're going to need to rewire America. We've got these remote sources of renewable energy. We need to get those to the distribution network, and building out the transmission lines will be key.
And I would like to just make a quick remark on sort of the potential federal actions to take in terms of implementing this bill. We were talking about the doing piece. Through our matchmaker program and our catalyze cohort, both of which are working with cities to identify sustainable infrastructure projects, I think one concern that has been voiced by cities, particularly through our direct engagement with them, is how do we ensure that the funding is flowing sort of equitably, right? We don't want the usual suspects of big cities to, and it's good for them, but at the same time, we have many, many small cities. CDP works with cities, with populations as small as 10,000 people. How do we ensure that these smaller cities also are provided the necessary support in terms of funding and knowledge in terms of how to secure these grants, secure the funding for the sustainable infrastructure projects they're trying to pursue? I think it's a big piece of consideration here, so that we do have a more equitable distribution of funding, particularly to places where project sizes might not be as intriguing to investors, right? They might be under $1 million, might be under $2 million in total project cost, and that might be difficult to finance because they're quote unquote too small. At the same time, Another thing we want to be mindful of is that it's great we have a lot of money flowing, a lot of capital flowing towards these types of projects. There's a huge interest, as we know, with the ESG funding, with the green finance. There's a huge growing interest behind these movements. However, at the same time, this is borne out in our matchmaker data, where the projects are being discussed in more detail and information at CDP, is that close to half are actually in the pre-feasibility stage or in the scoping stage. How do we ensure that the projects that are out there are actually at a stage where we can say now we can put funding to it? I think there's a lot more support and capacity that needs to be built for smaller cities for these kinds of projects, so that we can actually ensure that the dollars allocated for more projects can be flowing to projects, because sometimes we see a bottleneck, mismatch between projects and funding. That's the two comments I would like to make on this.
Yeah, thank you. That's something we've heard a lot about in recent research, is just the numerous barriers to federal funding, and how the private sector and even other federal programs like the Climate Adaptation Science Centers can support these smaller cities in unlocking federal funds. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I want to really, a couple of you have mentioned the equity piece. I want to really focus in on that. And it relates to an audience question that we got as well. But how can infrastructure be used as a tool to increase equity and address climate risks for low-income communities? And our audience question particularly was asking about balancing cost and capacity of infrastructure with social equity to ensure that we're advancing towards a better future for all.
I can jump in here. I think there are different levels of infrastructure investment. There are more neighborhood-focused type investments, like housing and the infrastructure that goes around that housing, even energy infrastructure via community solar or direct rooftop solar. But then there's also larger scale projects that tend to be more the focus of the larger companies or more medium-sized companies. So I do think there's an opportunity to create opportunity and new investments along that spectrum. In New Orleans, we call them DBE enterprises, or disadvantaged business enterprises. And there's a process to become a disadvantaged business enterprise. Once someone reaches that designation, then they're included in a pool and opportunities are made available on public works projects locally. So we want to take that a step further and encourage the ownership of companies, not just participation. That's great, but also the ownership of DBE companies, so that they can be the 100% contract on certain projects or development projects, which is a key area that we're investing in, because development, and it tackles a lot of different areas: housing, infrastructure, social aspects. So we see that as a chance to create more wealth in the DBE community, or BIPOC, Black community, brown communities, women-owned businesses, etc. They all fall into that category. So you just the cities have to be intentional about it, and they have to take it seriously. They have to enforce it. There's no magic wand that any city can wave, I don't believe. I think it all has to do with putting it on paper, making sure that the people within the organizations are taking that seriously, they're enforcing it, they're building out those relationships. There's a lot of technical assistance and nurturing of those companies that needs to happen. So there's a role for the different players in the ecosystem to help influence that process. Corporations can have programs where they train the smaller businesses. Some of that is going on here in New Orleans. So you can connect the dots across the stream, and it's really all up to what that community needs, and that community has to come up with a plan, and everybody has to stick to it.
If you don't mind me jumping here as well, I would like to talk about there's very, as Damon pointed out, there's varying perspectives, varying ways of looking at the outcome. Part of that is the economic development piece, where with the implementation of these projects, you would see more opportunities for jobs, for career development, for companies to come up and tackle these challenges. At the same time, there is a lot of co-benefits for sustainable infrastructure to come about, right? If we're talking about addressing the urban heat island effect, planting more trees, for example, as a green infrastructure project would help alleviate some of that stress to vulnerable populations and low-income communities. At the same time, I think with the equity piece, you could also talk about the the need to engage communities in the planning process, right? Part of what we're talking about within the catalyze cohort, we're working with cities and engaging with the communities and the private sector, is the need for public engagement. How do you bring in your vulnerable communities within your cities to have a say, a part in designing and planning these infrastructure projects along with the private sector? It's sometimes there is a contentious sort of relationship between the public and private, the nonprofit communities groups, but I think a smart way to go about tackling a lot of these challenges is having everybody sit together at a table, which is this thing we're trying to create here at CDP, to talk through these issues, to really collaborate with each other and bring equity to the forefront, not just during the implementation stage, but rather during the planning, the design stages of a project, right? So then you have equity that's threaded throughout the entire process of an infrastructure project. And I think that's a huge opportunity here for us to make better communities for everybody.
Yeah, I would agree with my co-panelists, absolutely. And just say, I think, you've seen with this bill and before that, even just a recognition, projects are wonderful. It's nice to use the latest design and material and what have you, but it's really, infrastructure is about people, and it's all about, equity in a way. If you have good, reliable, modern infrastructure, you're going to have access, you're going to have opportunity, you're going to have jobs, you're going to have a better quality of life. So if we look at that, then that really transforms the way we plan and prioritize projects with equity as a lens. And you saw in the FEMA strategic plan, they're using equity as a lens. I think you're going to see that in a lot of other departments as well. And as William said, and Damon as well, it's about being intentional. And the bare minimum for the environmental process for projects is you do a scoping meeting, and then you put up your sandwich board, and then it sometimes happens in the past that the squeaky wheel, the letter writing campaigns, those with influence are the ones that would steer the direction of a project. And I think that's changing, thinking of new ways to bring everyone, communities of all sizes, into the conversation, and really change how we prioritize the way we do infrastructure projects. Communities that are flooded over and over again, communities that were divided by highways. One of the things we're excited about is that Reconnecting Communities program, where we're going to look at some of those past decisions that were made where communities were bifurcated by highways, and see if there is a pot of funding to correct some of those past decisions and move forward.
Thank you. Yeah, and getting more to the project delivery side of things for those communities and others. You all have touched on sort of financing tools and approaches, but I'm wondering if we could expand a little bit about innovative financing tools and approaches that are available to support investments in resilient infrastructure, and any examples where these tools have been used successfully. I think that would be helpful to hear about.
Well, right now with Finance New Orleans, we're rebuilding our bond issuance platform. The community comes to us because they want to issue bonds for a housing project or a green infrastructure project, or we may issue bonds on our own because we're financing a pool of mortgages or a pool of projects even. So that's been our key focus. But one of the bigger issues that we run into in the public finance world, speaking of equity, there's financial equity that's also needed in order to stimulate these projects. So on top of the intent of the social equity, which should be the foundation and the core that drives these projects, the reality is you need financial capital, and many cities are strapped, particularly the cities that need the most help. If they had the capital, then some of these problems might be solved already. So I do think there are increasing opportunities to or for agencies like ours are trying out different structures that public finance agencies might not normally do. Green banks are issuing certain types of certificates backed by energy credits. There are impact models out there where bonds are paid back based on the success of the project. So you're starting to see those types of tools, but I do think it has to go a step further, because those are great, but at the end of the day, you just need raw capital sometimes. and you need some private parties to come in with the public agencies and take a risk, and they get their return, and it could be a market return, or it could be a moderate return, or even below market in some cases. It just really depends on what that third party needs, or a group of third parties. So I think what needs to happen moving forward to truly make an impact in the cities is to get those organizations, the large corporations that have the capital, the foundations that have the intent and the mission mindedness, and then the city agencies that own the assets and own the results of all of these projects. I think bringing those forces together to co-invest in projects is the future, and we talk about it over and over again. But I do think there are specific examples of private equity being brought in alongside, public finance bond platforms in order to bring projects to life. So I expect to see more of that moving forward.
I would like to add a couple things here as well. I think one thing that this country has been sort of loath to talk about is public-private partnerships. This is something that's sort of disjointed across states and has been a problem, I think, for a lot of infrastructure projects where state over state has different regulations. Some states might allow it, might not allow it. I think this is a great opportunity to really come together, really explore this option, because when done properly, it can address sort of the financial equity, the social equity that Damon has spoken about. And it's a model that a lot of cities that we talk to are interested in having. And that would require sort of state level support. Another thing sort of on the innovative financing mechanisms too, recently we've seen this past year, the Buffalo Sewer District issuing an environmental impact bond, which is sort of the largest in the country right now. And that's tied to, the financing cost is tied to the the environmental outcomes, the performance of the projects being implemented. So if you do better with the outcomes, your financing costs, it varies accordingly. A similar bond issuance was done by Burlington, I believe was earlier this week, where they're doing a net zero energy revenue bond that will basically try to accelerate Burlington, Vermont's goals to achieve net zero, and that's also tied to sort of the performance of the projects. So there are very new ways of doing financing these days, where a lot of times this is tied to the sort of the environmental data and impact they report to CDP, or how well they perform would impact how much the financing is for these these issuers and borrowers. So that's another thing. Just want to touch on quickly in terms of an example.
All right. Well, one last question to wrap up our panel. I would love to hear what you guys are most excited about when it comes to infrastructure and resilient infrastructure. We have a huge opportunity right now. So what keeps you going in your work?
I can jump in. I mean, first of all, I'm excited that infrastructure is in the conversation because for decades, it was just kind of this out of sight, out of mind thing that there were other top tier issues capturing national attention. So the fact that this was a priority for the administration, for Congress, for voters is exciting. And, every time I join a panel or listen to a presentation on the legislation, I learn something new. There's just so much to unpack because of the scope of this bill, but I think it's a great opportunity for all stakeholders to help meet the moment and kind of realize the potential of this legislation and get it right. So we're going to need to be giving feedback to the administration and the agencies about what's working and not working, get our codes and standards up to snuff so that when these projects get going, they're built to last. But I think, this is just the beginning, really. Kind of like the dog that caught the car. But I think there's a lot of potential to do things differently, to create resilient communities and to make an impact in people's lives.
If I may jump in here, I'll let Damon have the last word. I think this is actually a very interesting time. The last 2 years have been in many ways very dire in terms of a lot of things that has happened to us. both personally, but also on a societal level. But at the same time, I think the exposure of the gaps, the exposure of the problems is actually, on the flip side, great opportunities for us to build better, right? I believe, with all this data transparency, as more cities, local governments disclose their environmental impacts, as more companies do so, as we start to share more information about how we're doing, both on an environmental but also social basis within the ESG framework, we can actually identify opportunities, ways to partner together and work together better. And also at the same time, I think, this is a great opportunity for us to really think about what kind of future we want. And to be frank, the environmental space has been, sort of dominated by certain corporations, certain groups of people, but at the same time, this has become sort of an equity issue too, right? I think today's panel does a great job demonstrating. It's sort of atypical in terms of diversity for an environmental panel in many ways, and I love seeing sort of more people like from different backgrounds, from different places, come together and becoming leaders in this movement to build better cities. And I see this as a great future for us going forward, and to collaborate across non-traditional lines. And that's kind of what I'm excited about.
Yeah, I appreciate what Emily and William had to say, especially about building better cities. And I'm excited because this is a legitimate opportunity to recreate our communities that have been left behind, that have needed investment for a very long time. So that's one thing that keeps me and I know a lot of people in our community excited, because it is a chance to do something different and to rewrite the rules, to write more equitable rules, to create better outcomes, to have more involvement, to just have a better quality of life for everybody. And that doesn't necessarily mean everybody becoming rich or anything like that. It just means a better quality of life, better neighborhoods, a better way of living. And then also what also excites me is the opportunity to create new ideas, new companies. I think there are many ideas that haven't even come to the surface yet. Emily said the dog that caught the car. We are at the beginning, and this will go on for quite some time. So I expect the next 10 to 20 years to be full of innovation, to be full of new ideas. And we're going to have I think more entrepreneurs are going to gravitate to this concept of having better cities, because that's probably more important than anything else. We'll have a lot more talent and energy coming into this space. So I'm excited to see that happen.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for your thoughts and your time today. We really appreciate it. I will now turn it over to Amy Holm from the Climate Registry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Really appreciate that. And thank you, Damon, Emily, William, and Laura for this really timely discussion on what is needed to scale up infrastructure investment and build resilient and equitable communities. We have our work cut out for us. I'm Amy Holm, Executive Director of the Climate Registry and co-host of the Climate Leadership Conference. I now have the great pleasure of welcoming back to the Climate Leadership virtual stage newly re-elected Mayor of New Orleans, LaToya Cantrell. The May Exchange feels like it could have been years ago, Mayor, but we are thrilled to have you back in an extended format on this important topic. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thank you. So, as you know, we had intended to bring an in-person 2021 Climate Leadership Conference to New Orleans this past fall, but we had to pivot to virtual programming, first because of another COVID surge, and then because New Orleans got hit so terribly by Hurricane Ida. I know that you got your start in public service after Hurricane Katrina, and I'd love to hear more about your experience and what was motivating you at the time to get deeper involved in the community.
Okay, well, thank you again, Amy, and for your leadership and that of this conference. Sorry you were not able to come to New Orleans, but keeping us embedded and engaged is something that we're very grateful for. My road into the political arena has always been really rooted and grounded in community service and grassroots organizing. When Hurricane Katrina hit 16 years ago, I was serving as the president of my neighborhood organization, the Broadmoor Improvement Association. After the levees failed 16 years ago, thank God they did not this time around, which speaks to, big investments bring about big results. But that levee breach flooded and inundated the city with 80% of floodwaters, and we lived with it for weeks. Broadmoor was one of the neighborhoods considered like the bottom of the bowl. So when the levees failed, we got the floodwater, although we were dry after Katrina. But when those levees failed, we got the water, anywhere between 9 to 12 feet of water for a period of 3 weeks. My neighborhood is considered a microcosm of the city of New Orleans, demographically and social economically. We were recommended to the mayor at the time, along with 7 neighborhoods collectively, not to return, not to be rebuilt. And so we woke up, meaning residents of my community woke up to our local newspaper in January with green dots and one green dot placed over our neighborhood. And for us, that was a signal that the recommendation not to come back was pretty much imminent. We organized ourselves. I'm quoted as saying all hell broke loose when we saw that green dot, and we began to plan for our future, ensuring that we would not only come back, but we would build back better than we were before. And so embracing green infrastructure in our planning efforts, we created a redevelopment plan over 328 pages, over 100 meetings and the like with our community. And as I look today, 98% of that redevelopment plan has been fully implemented at the grassroots and community level, but being the only neighborhood plan that was embedded in every single planning process that the city went through, as well as the state of Louisiana went through when it comes to rebuilding after Hurricane Katrina. And so many of the pillars of that was focusing on, our housing stock, flood mitigation, of course, green infrastructure, finding and figuring ways to hold water, freeing up the water from going into our drains immediately. We raised millions of dollars to rebuild our public library as a library and a community center that has proven to be the model for the city and its recovery through Hurricane Katrina. Our public school was one of the first to be rebuilt in the community as well in the city, embracing green infrastructure, a cistern that holds water, bioswales that holds water. And what's so funny about it, 16 years ago when the community was pushing these initiatives, at the time, government was like, oh, no, LaToya, people are going to drown in the bioswale at Wilson School. They'll drown. Well, not even understanding that bioswale holds the water. It receives the water in terms of going into the ground, freeing it up from our drains, but it would not be a pool nor a standing pool. And we got the arguments about mosquitoes, and sure enough, no mosquitoes. It's about the vegetation you use. So fast forward 16 years, the city of New Orleans, we're leaders in this space on a national level for green infrastructure improvements, investments, and it is just nicely aligned with the fact that, we are on the front lines of climate change. It's not about climate is changing, it has. And we're seeing the impacts of that right now in my city. And you know what? We're going to continue to be leaders in this space because the future of our city depends upon it. And of course, on a global scale, we're not in this alone.
Well, thank you for your really inspiring story and for sharing that. And I love that you were on you were doing Build Back Better years ago. So you're very well experienced in what needs to happen in that regard, as we really focus on that now. So here you are now. You've been convincingly reelected to a second term, and you're recently back from Glasgow, from COP26, representing the U.S. Conference of Mayors. What do you see as the top priorities for the country in terms of our quest to address the climate crisis?
Well, top priority has to be, one, our country taking climate change very seriously, and the fact that we are now back embedded in the agreement, the Paris Agreement, and of course being at COP26 solidified that, and we wore masks as saying America is all in. So the first step for us is to be all in. We know that if we do not slow down heat by 2030, then we will not be able to slow it down at all. And so the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions to prevent further warming is our priority, I know, as a city, but absolutely as a country. And I want to make sure that the city of New Orleans is doing her part in this country, so that the U.S. collectively, that we're doing our part for the world. And so we have our climate action plan that calls for the city, to meet net zero emissions by 2050 and by 50% by 2035. We initially had that by 2030. We're well into this decade right now, and just making sure, again, that we're making the investments necessary at every level, from our Solar for All New Orleans program, which make sure that we have local solar industry to encourage rooftop solar on our homes throughout our city. In 2020, we had over 450 new homes sign up for this program, and each seeing a savings of over $500 a year. That's a big deal that goes right back into their disposable income. But even as we think about planning for the future, and this city sees hurricane season every single year, and we're seeing, being at the forefront of climate change, we're seeing that the 100-year storms are no more, that they're coming every 15 and even 5 years. Last year, 2020, the city of New Orleans saw herself 8 times in the cone of uncertainty, and we experienced 2 hurricanes, Zeta last year and Hurricane Ida this year, being one of the strongest that we have seen since Hurricane Katrina. And so while we saw that our levees held and our water utility held as well, we do see signs of needing to move towards a sheltering in place model because we are on the front lines. And so we're going to continue to implement initiatives, even in terms of our electrical vehicle charging stations, designing a network of over 50 EVs throughout the city, and of course, moving towards electrical vehicles that we are purchasing as a city on many different levels. Our utility scale solar, working to turn our vacant land into large scale solar installations, working right now with the federal government, looking at one of our former landfills to be turned into a solar farm, a substation for our utility. So being very creative and innovative right now is the time to do it, because we don't have time to waste. We've wasted enough.
Exactly. So you've elaborated a little bit on the distinct the threats from the climate change that are having on your city. I'm interested in knowing what adaptation and resiliency measures have been successful, and what you have identified as needing additional work. You touched on it a little bit about more EV stations. This idea is harbor safe in place. So just if you could elaborate on that. And I'm also very interested to hear how these measures are being put into place, but with federal partnership as well.
Sure. So that's pretty, I would say, a lot packed into that. But what I will say also is that, it's not just about fossil fuel emissions that we're looking at as well. Although, coming in, I had to file lawsuit against oil and gas because our coast, has been damaged significantly, and the land that's been lost was a protective barrier in defending us from hurricanes and floods. And so I have to speak to, the need to rebuild our coastal, our wetlands, so that we can have the protective barriers in place to prevent us from not being here 50 years or 30 years from now. Because if the trends hold, New Orleans will truly be a coastal city, like literally. And so while we're shifting we talked about EV stations, talked about power substations through solar. I know you heard Damon talk about our mortgage fund with getting our people into homes that they can live in and be resilient in, and to beat back that carbon footprint, but keeping them in those homes and affordable for generations. Also, as it relates to our infrastructure relative to climate action, I mentioned investing in our power grid. That will also include solar farms, but also our water utility, power infrastructure. And we're building and going with a power plant now with efficient equipment and renewable energy platforms to reduce that carbon footprint. But the plant that we're building now would reduce the emissions by 35%. So we're very excited about that, and making sure that we put our investments and our money there, and leveraging those investments with federal dollars. And it's the right time with the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. It just puts us in a great position. And even when the city moved to sell bonds at the approval of our residents, and with a great credit rating, we realized a premium of over 70 million in addition to 250 million. So with the capital leverage, with the federal leverage, and then with the resources that we have, additional public dollars, we're making these investments in our streets, in our drainage infrastructure, green infrastructure. We're holding millions of gallons of water. We just completed the Pontilli water system in Gentilly, a community that really did see major flooding after Katrina, but is already seeing the impacts of this green infrastructure system. The residents are saying they see it working as the rain falls. And that's what we need, because as we're doing this work and as we are making it a priority, we also need to ensure that the community understands that these investments are there to protect their lives and protect their properties and protect the city's ability to be here for 300 more years. But also needing them to buy in to the investments that we need to have made, because we need to be working together and speaking from the same and talking points and speaking the same language in order to really reap the benefits from the federal government through this IIJA. And what I'm saying to my people, we're not looking at peanuts, meaning millions, we're looking at billions. And that's what this means to us right now. So it's an array of investments that we're looking to make in order to defend ourselves from climate change that is happening right before our eyes.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's certainly infrastructure is certainly the timely topic of the day. I'm wondering if there is some approach or partnership that you haven't seen yet, maybe on your wish list, that you could see as being something that we should be bringing to our toolkit that we're not using yet. Is there anything, even carbon capture, anything like that you'd like to see more of as part of the scaling up infrastructure?
Well, I really think that there's a need just for us to continue to encourage the clean energy industry, to build on, what's happening, but also to test solutions and all. The highest solar adoption rates, we're seeing that right now. I think that we need to continue to move this work forward. And I know that the city of New Orleans, look, we're trying to be as creative and innovative and look to others as for lessons learned. I'm looking, as I'm dealing with trash and trash collections, wanting that to pivot into energy and adapting and scaling up in that space. But I think that we're well on our way and on the right path. And so we're just going to continue to partner and to learn and to really listen for the robust clean energy industry I know in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm. And how is your regional partnership of other mayors of other cities? Are you kind of all on the same page in terms of trying to address these issues, and using similar tools?
Well, I believe so. I have had the opportunity to grow in a leadership capacity, like with the U.S. Conference of Mayors or the African Americans Mayors Association. And as I speak to my brother and sister mayors across the country, it looks like that we are working together. That we definitely work together to push this infrastructure bill forward to passage. We understand the impacts that it will have on our local municipalities and for the long term. So it requires us to work across all lines, and even in terms of, we've adopted the thought of, there's more than just a Republican or a Democrat, because it's mayors, and mayors don't have the luxury of picking a side. We have to serve everybody. And I think that also speaks to the federal administration, our president's guidance and leadership with embracing mayors, because the change that we're looking to see and have happen has to happen at the local level, and it cannot happen without mayors working together, but also embracing the changes that need to occur. So I feel that, we're at the right place at the right time to have full leverage on the resources and the time in which we're serving in these capacities today.
Terrific. And I was able to participate at COP26 too, and saw Governor John Bell Edwards there. Mm-hmm. So it's nice that you have that partnership at the gubernatorial level too.
Yeah, it's important. It's important. But what we do know is that with execution, you need your local leaders, and mayors are at the forefront, and time is of the essence, and we're the ones that have to lean in the hardest in order to get the results on the ground and be the most accountable, quite frankly. And so I'm pleased with the leadership at the federal level. I'm pleased to have a partner at the state level, but also I understand the impacts as it relates to preemption legislation that happens at the state level and the like, and where those who don't believe climate change is real, we don't have the luxury of that because we're living it and we're facing it every single day. And so I'm just pleased at where we are now, and just very committed to the future of our city, of my state, and of this country, and the world for that matter.
Well, good. I'd love to hear some final thoughts from you about that as we wrap up. I mean, I think what was inspiring to one of the many things that you said that was inspiring to me today was that citizens of New Orleans are noticing these improvements in their cities, and they're connecting it with climate resiliency and adaptation and addressing the climate crisis, which is all, often a concern, like it's too far away, we can't do anything about it. And so having, knowing that there's that feedback coming back to you has to be very gratifying. But looking to the future, what does give you hope that we can really make a difference in addressing and solving the climate crisis?
Well, a couple things give me hope. And Amy, I would have to say at that very grassroots level, that's where it is. Because if we're really going to realize the changes that need to occur and live with these changes, we're going to need the people on the ground to embrace the changes and adapt accordingly, and demonstrate how resilient not only they are, but that we are collectively. This also dovetails very well in terms of the leverage at the federal level, and having an administration that embraces climate change, that understands that it is our time to act right now. Like, that's what we have right now. And we cannot say that existed even 2 years ago, and we lost ground. And so the fact that we have now, and we're regaining ground, that gives me hope as well. In addition to that are the resources that's tied to the call to action. You can't do it without the dollars. And so with trillions, 1.7 trillion being allocated to meet our people and the needs of our communities where they are, it really does give hope. So it's about action, and now it's transitioning to results. And it's going to be mayors like myself across this country that gets the results that we need in this country to play our part on that global scale.
And those results, that's the story that needs to be told next, of the results and the impact, so people can really understand that.
Yes.
Mayor Cantrell, we so appreciate your leadership and for chatting with me today and sharing your insights with our Climate Leadership Conference audience. And we just very much appreciate your time. We know you're very busy and have important work to do.
Yep, we all do. And thank you very much. Thank you so much. And let's just keep it going. The future of our world clearly depends upon it.
Definitely. We will. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So on behalf of the entire Climate Leadership Conference team, I'd like to thank all of our speakers who have shared their knowledge with us, not only today, but throughout the 2021 Virtual Climate Leadership Series. We have enjoyed engaging conversations on critical climate solutions over the past few months. We hope that all of you in the audience are leaving inspired and armed with a few new tools to take back to your respective organizations. A reminder that all of our video recordings from throughout the series, just over a dozen sessions, are available on the CLC YouTube channel. And I also want to give a shout out to all our 2021 sponsors. This series, all of this work, all of these wonderful speakers, this would not have been made possible without your generous support. So thank you so very much. We wish all of you a joyous holiday season, a happy new year, and look forward to continuing on a path to a net zero, climate resilient future. See you all in 2022.